Welcome to Allyship, sponsored by ACS-START. Today, 3 committees have come together to create an allyship experience over the next 2 days. We are pleased to see so many of you here today and are thankful that you took the time out of your busy schedule to join us. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I would like to go over some reminders. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question anonymously, you may send your comments or questions to one of the designated chat managers. The chat managers are team members with 2 asterisks before their names. Please be sure to mute yourself if you are not speaking. Use the chat feature for questions regarding the inner workings of ACS-START. If you have questions that we do not have time to address today, please save them for the safe space activity tomorrow. As a note, this forum will be recorded at a later date for future use. And finally, resources will be emailed to you with the recording of today's forum. Next. It is important to ACS-START that you know that this is a safe space. You are welcome to express yourself without judgment. We ask that you please be mindful that you conduct yourself in accordance with ACS values. Next. I've been a member of ACS-START since its inception, which coincidentally was about 1 year ago today. And since that time, I've invited many people to join what I think is a great organization. And most people say they don't think it's a good fit for them and that they're not a member of an oppressed or marginalized group. Well, today we're going to explain what each of you can do to become an ally. No pressure, but we would like you to share a possibility with each of you. Next. In the summer of 2020, the world was reeling from the ravages of COVID-19. For the most part, people were staying at home as ordered, and on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer during an arrest. For the Black community, this wasn't news. It was business as usual. For something was different for somebody, an anti-racism protest started in Minneapolis and spread across the world from New Zealand to Brazil. For the first time, every race could be seen clearly participating in these protests. And the idea of allies and allyship became not just a concept, but a reality. Next slide. In today's forum, Scott Miller will define ally and explain who can be an ally. Karen Pollitt, Becky Medina, and Karen Station will then explain the next step, allyship, and explain the need for allyship. They will then explain the difference between being an ally versus being an accomplice, and finally, how to practice allyship. Angela Reapy will then review the 7 roles of allyship: the sponsor, the champion, the amplifiers, the advocate, the scholar, the upstander, and the confidant. I will then close the forum and open the floor for questions and comments and discuss next steps. Next slide. Scott will now describe to us what an ally is.
What does it mean to be an ally? An ally is a person who makes an intentional decision to understand, empathize, and act in support of others. In relation to the work at ACS-START committee, an ally is a person who positions themselves to advocate and work toward ending discriminatory action against marginalized groups. It should be noted that allies are often not members of the marginalized groups. Next slide, please. Who can be an ally? This quote from the Emily Lamont's Guide to Allyship says it best, I think. Anyone has the potential to be an ally. Allies recognize that though they are not a member of the underinvested and oppressed communities they support, they make a concerted effort to better understand the struggle every single day because an ally might have more privilege and recognizes said privilege. They are powerful voices alongside oppressed ones. Next slide, please. So being an ally is about recognizing your privilege, then using it in solidarity with marginalized groups to challenge the status quo. It often involves working through discomfort, listening, and learning from mistakes. For me, as a white person, and a male for that matter, I think this quote from Francis Ramsey is an important concept for white folks to think about. Privilege does not mean that you are rich, that you have had an easy life. All it means is that there are some things in life that you will not experience or ever have to think about simply because of who you are. I will now turn the program over to Rebecca to discuss allyship.
Thank you, Scott. Karen, Pollitt, and I will be exploring allyship and what that looks like. To begin, what is allyship? Allyship is a personal choice, and it will look like a unique journey to all. When practicing allyship, it is important to note there is no one-size-fits-all approach. In this section, we will be exploring that allyship is an action and that anyone can be an ally at any level. A position of power or expertise is not necessary to make effective change. Allyship is not an identity, and it is not a performance, as the road to allyship is a lifelong process that includes building relationships, education, solidarity, and being open to learning how we can be better allies to marginalized people and communities. Next, please. In continuation, Dr. McKinney King explains in this quote, is that allyship goes beyond noticing something is just unjust. As allies, we must act and correct any wrongs. When practicing allyship, we can remind ourselves that actions speak louder than words. Someone cannot simply declare themselves an ally. Allies are defined by their actions. Injustices exist on many levels, including racism, sexism, homophobia, and classism. Similarly, allyship applies to the same isms. Next, please. As mentioned earlier, allyship is a journey that calls for action. The Rochester Racial Justice Toolkit has been a great resource in providing the definition of what it is to be an ally. This resource emphasizes that allyship journey requires unlearning and reevaluating. As we learn more information and become more comfortable in our roles as allies, we will be better equipped to stand in solidarity and work alongside with marginalized groups of people to take down the systems that challenge that group's basic rights, equal access, and ability to thrive in our society. As we move through this section, we will provide examples on how to practice allyship in the workplace and outside of the office. Next, please. Here we are providing an example that allyship is a journey, and each step of the journey brings an increasing level of responsibility that comes with allyship. We are utilizing the active citizen continuum here as an example for the allyship continuum. As we continue to learn and unlearn and identify different roles of allies, our allyship will begin to evolve and move through this continuum. We also recognize that life has its twists and turns. Therefore, we understand if our roles as allies modify or change. We can still stay on our ally journey. Next slide, please. I will now introduce my colleague, Karen Pollitt, who will be expanding on how to practice allyship.
As mentioned by Scott and Rebecca, allyship can be demonstrated by your physical presence at rallies and protests, and possibly standing up with marginalized communities to provide assistance. Another example is volunteering your time with organizations that provide support to these communities. And it could be simple as addressing an inappropriate comment made by a coworker. Next slide. Educating your peers and sharing resources with others is another form of allyship, as is staying informed about initiatives so you can communicate information effectively and correctly. Some actionable steps are simply having a conversation and being an active listener. Acknowledge your ignorance and ask questions. Take time to understand the struggles of marginalized communities. If you don't take time to understand and listen, you really can't become an ally. Most of all, be consistent and keep chipping away to educate yourself and make that transition to an ally. Close the gap between good intentions and standing up for a marginalized group. Next slide. Do you want to help, but you don't really know where to start? Monetary donations are a great form of allyship. There are many national and local Chicago groups that need donations to support their work. And here we've listed just a few in the Chicago area. Next slide. Allyship in the workplace recognizes the privileges that majority groups have in a professional context, and using that privilege to aid in the dismantling of processes that prevent colleagues from having equal opportunities. This may not initially be an easy task. We tend to make the assumption that if we feel safe in a space that's inclusive, safe and pleasant, and that everyone else must feel the same way. As we were preparing for today, we thought about a couple of scenarios that happened here at ACS. We often use the terms rude and unprofessional to excuse a behavior when in actuality, it was an opportunity to be an ally when we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is marginalized. Allyship is about considering who is represented in that space and who is not, and then ask why. Then consider who has a voice that is being heard in the space and who doesn't, and ask why. Let's walk through a few scenarios that are real workplace scenarios from the college. Next slide. Including pronouns in your email signature and social media profiles is another quick and easy way to show allyship and inclusivity. It shows you care about individual preferences. It creates a safe space of sorts so everyone can feel comfortable bringing their whole self to work. This leads to greater productivity, creativity, and enhances our connections with one another. You'll see on staff signature lines, many have already started using pronouns in their signature line, and that's something you could do today. So now we'll walk through the scenarios to illustrate allyship. Next slide. So at a department team meeting that was happening, there was a diverse group present. A BIPOC team member, who we'll call Susan, tried multiple times to make a suggestion for a new project. Another team member, who we'll call Barb, continually talked over her and interrupted Susan, so she was never able to fully share her perspective. So you may be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, Barb is so rude. She won't let Susan talk at all. How much longer do we have to listen to Barb interrupt? When really this was an opportunity for allyship. We could have inserted ourselves to say, excuse me, Barb, Susan's been trying to give her perspective. Could we allow her to finish her thought? Or maybe turn it around and draw the attention to Susan and say, Susan, I think your idea is a great one. Would you please repeat it so the entire team can hear it? Basically inserting yourself into a situation where you can draw the attention to the person who's being marginalized. Next slide. So here's another real scenario that happened at the college. It was during a committee meeting when a surgeon was meeting a staff person for the first time. And the surgeon said to the staff person, oh, from your name, I didn't expect you to be Black. You don't sound Black. And then he walked away. So my thought was, oh my gosh, I can't believe he just said that. He's a surgeon, he's my committee chair. What do I possibly say to him? Here was an opportunity to show allyship, and where I personally failed with this. And it'd be interesting to see what others would have said. Next slide. Here are some action words to remember for being an ally in the workplace. Ask yourself how you might act as an ally in order to support those people who may not be represented, or who may not have a voice, in order to actively make the space more equitable. To practice allyship, we need to listen and to take direction from those with lived experiences of marginalization and oppression, as well as resistance in organizing. Be willing to show up and put in the work to make yourself aware, including educating yourself. If acting as an ally sounds uncomfortable and challenging in times, that's because it is. But together we can all get through that. Next slide.
Thank you, Karen. I'll be providing information on what it is to be an accomplice and what it means to take a step further in terms of allyship. Next slide, please. As a friendly reminder, an accomplice is an ally, but the difference is that this tier of ally is a radical stance. It is direct and requires overt action. As we begin and continue our journeys as allies, accomplice is a role that we can evolve to if we are comfortable. The accomplice role is not a role that is required to jump into if we are not ready. Using the Great Lakes Equity Center as a resource, I'm happy to break down ally and accomplice on behalf of my affinity group co-lead, Marta Zuniga. I have included the source information at the bottom of the slide if you'd like to continue your education on this term. Using the Great Lakes Center as a resource, we can define ally as an ally is committed to continuing their education and recognizing their privilege. working in solidarity with marginalized groups by working through discomfort, listening, and learning through mistakes. Next slide, please. Accomplice. Being an accomplice is more than just listening to others about their struggle. It is about solidifying a course of action that is committed to undoing it. A historical example of this is the Freedom Rides in the summer of 1961, where Black people and white accomplices rode buses across the southern states in nonviolent protests of segregated transportation. A number of individuals involved were physically assaulted, chased, and arrested, including the white accomplices. In this example, the accomplices took their solidarity a step further and placed their lives on the front lines as physical representations of their protest against the rampant and systemic racism in this country. This historical example shows the commitment of being an accomplice. Some allies may not feel ready to step into this role of an accomplice, and that is okay. Next slide, please. In continuation of this example of the accomplice role, not all accompliship results in physical harm, but it does require a position that is indisputably communicates our stance on advocating alongside marginalized groups. Revisiting allyship and how we can practice that role, to name a few examples, an ally will volunteer their time at a local organization to support an activity or event, such as distributing water bottles or lunches at a rally, calling your local legislator's office, providing shelter for protesters, amplifying voices and advocating for others, recognizing systemic racism, inequalities, and realize the impact of microaggressions, listen, support, self-reflect, and change. Next slide, please. I will now introduce my colleague, Angelica Riepke, who will be presenting on allyship in action.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Becky. We have introduced you to what an ally is and who can be an ally. Now let's talk about the various roles that allies can take on to make a difference and the importance of those roles. Being a supportive and effective ally involves action. Active allies recognize and utilize their privilege to help create more inclusive, respectful environments, which is critically important within the workplace. Just as we are all diverse individuals, allyship can take on equally diverse roles. Here are a few of the beneficial roles that allies can take on to support colleagues from underrepresented groups: the sponsor, the champion, the amplifier, the advocate, the scholar, the upstander, and the confidant. Over the next few minutes, we will discuss the meaning and impact of each of these roles. Next slide, please. Let's begin with the sponsor. The sponsor openly and genuinely supports colleagues from underrepresented groups in a professional context. A sponsor takes the opportunity to talk about the talents of others when it counts, like during discussions about performance and promotions with other influencers, or recommending colleagues for committees or assignments that provide career development and advancement opportunities. The sponsor can make decisions or influence decisions, and that puts them in the perfect position to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, in my past career working for a REIT or real estate investment trust, there was a very little diversity in management. As a Black female, also under 30 at the time, I was in rare company. My manager, a well-respected vice president, was a significant sponsor for me in that he took frequent opportunities to say things like, Angelica found a way to generate 20% more revenue through our partners, or you should talk to Angelica, she's my go-to on that subject. This type of sponsorship helped build my credibility and professional capital and ultimately set me up for a future promotion. Next slide, please. The champion is someone who publicly sends a powerful message to others by deferring to colleagues from underrepresented groups during meetings, events, and conferences. For example, the champion would vocally advocate for more people of color, women, and others of diverse backgrounds to serve as panelists or speakers at events. Instead of regularly being the one in the forefront or having representation from the same group of people, the champion would refer to underrepresented colleagues with similar expertise to act as subject matter experts. A great example of this is last June, Alexis Ohanian, co-founder of Reddit, relinquished his board seat and asked to be replaced by a Black professional. The idea of giving up a seat of power to make room for someone equally, or in some instances more qualified, sends a strong message and is a great example of a champion in action. Next slide, please. Next, we have the amplifier. The amplifier focuses on representation and communication. They are sensitive to making certain all voices have an opportunity to be heard. The amplifier promotes this by inviting members of underrepresented groups to speak at staff meetings or take on high visibility roles. When a good idea is proposed, the amplifier can help boost the visibility of their colleagues through solidarity and giving credit. For example, in a meeting, the amplifier gives shout outs like, "That was a great idea Kim came up with regarding increasing participation in our training events. We should consider it and give more discussion to it." The amplifier also creates ways to ensure all voices are heard. For instance, they may encourage rotation of who leads meetings or set up other opportunities for each person to have a voice on an agenda. Next slide, please. The advocate. The advocate recognizes and calls out unjust omissions by holding peers accountable for including colleagues of all genders, races, ethnicities, abilities, ages, etc., in highly exclusive circles. The advocate pays close attention to invitation lists for events of influence, strategic planning meetings, and other career building opportunities. And if they see someone from an underrepresented group is missing, advocates for them to be included. The advocate also offers to introduce colleagues from underrepresented groups to influential people in their network. An example of this is a professional peer of mine from another organization is on a council for technology leaders. She noticed that a high-profile invite-only event for women leaders in technology had no racial diversity reflected on the invite list. She was aware of diverse female leaders who should have been included on the list. She pointed this out to her fellow council members and advocated for more inclusion in the event. She was successful in securing much-deserved invites for these previously overlooked leaders. Next slide, please. The scholar. So the scholar proactively and genuinely seeks to learn as much as possible about the challenges and prejudices faced by colleagues. Someone in this role completes their own research to seek relevant information about the history and challenges faced by marginalized groups versus being dependent on members of the group to educate them. This is much appreciated, as it can be taxing and frustrating to marginalized people to be solely responsible for educating others on their experience. Another key aspect of scholars is that they focus on listening and learning while refraining from inserting their own opinions, experiences, and/or ideas. Participation in events like Safe Space, even if only to listen and learn, as well as utilizing the ACS-START Education and Training Resource Library are good examples of being a scholar. Next slide, please. The upstander is the opposite of a bystander because she or they sees wrongdoing and acts to combat it. The upstander speaks up when witnessing behavior or speech that is degrading or offensive and pushes back on offensive comments, regardless of whether members of the targeted group are present. When addressing wrongdoing, upstanders explain their stance so everyone is clear why they raised an issue with what was said or done. For example, I was compelled to address a colleague at a former company for making a comment that one of his employees may not be interested in a management role because she had recently had a baby. I asked him why he made the assumption that she would not be interested in career advancement based on her personal choice to have a family. As we talked through it, I reminded him that that type of assumption is rarely, if ever, made in reference to male colleagues. He had not realized the potential impact of his assumptions and appreciated the discussion and feedback. Next slide, please. The confidant. So the confidant creates a safe space for members of underrepresented groups to express their fears, frustrations, and needs. They listen to the stories of those in underrepresented groups and believe in their experience versus questioning or interjecting their own opinions. This is especially important as confidants don't assume something can't happen due to their own lack of personal experience. An example of this is if a Black colleague tells a story of being refused help in a store, the confidant would listen fully to the colleague's experience and take in the information versus questioning whether the event happened or making excuses for what happened. Next slide, please. Now that we have walked through the various roles allies can play, there are a few key takeaways we should all understand about the impact and sustainability of allyship. First, there is no ally role that is more significant than the other. Each role played can make a difference in promoting inclusive, safe, and equitable spaces. Second, being an ally is an ongoing process, and one may take on any of the roles we discussed at any given time, depending on the circumstance. Last but not least, allies are human. We are not perfect and don't need to be. An ally chooses to use their position and influence to support others. They are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and continue to learn, do better, and support underrepresented colleagues. Ultimately, being an ally requires intention, introspection, adaptability, and action. Now I will turn it over to Veronica Bridgewaters to close out our discussion.
Next slide, please. Here is the wonderful education, training, and resources team. I won't say each of their names, but please take a moment to read them to yourselves. They have worked very hard to make today's presentation possible and deserve a big shout out. I'd like to thank each of you for your creativity and energy you put into making all of our Lunch and Learn successful. Please accept my heartfelt thanks. Next slide, please. And there's a special thanks here to Rebecca Medina and Martha Saniga from the Affinity Groups and Safe Space teams. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for attending today. If you have any questions or comments, or if you would like to join the ACS-START team, please contact us at the following email.